Good evening and welcome to our first Mary Talk of our 10th season. My name is Philip Duggins and I'm with the Alumni Engagement Office here at Mary Washington. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. We are excited to host a sizable audience of almost 400 for tonight's presentation, which includes alumni, students, parents, and friends from across the country and beyond. As with past lectures, there will be time after the presentation for our guests to answer any questions you might have. Feel free to ask questions by clicking on the Q&A icon below or submitting there, or vote for other submitted questions to help them rise to the top of the list. At this time, I'd like to introduce Armand Barnes, class of 2023. Armand, thank you for joining us.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Armand Barnes, and I am an alumni of the University of Mary Washington. I have the honor tonight of introducing Dr. Leppanen, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological Science. In my sophomore year, I met Dr. Leppanen during the height of the pandemic when he was my professor during his first semester at UMW. In all honesty, it was a difficult time for both students and faculty to navigate the classroom environment. While we had to social distance and wear masks the whole time, Dr. Leppanen still found a way to make my cognitive psychology class interesting and interactive. After having a great experience with Dr. Leppanen as my professor, I continued to take courses with him in both cognitive neuroscience and research methods for psychology. During this time, when I was still acclimating to college and doing my best to find community and opportunities on campus, Dr. Leppanen recommended me to the psychology faculty to apply to be a lab aide for the department. I was grateful to Dr. Leppanen for recommending me for an opportunity that truly helped me grow during my time as a student at UMW. I looked up to Dr. Leppanen because he was also new to UMW near the same time that I began as a student, and I could see how he was already being recognized for the great work that he does. Dr. Leppanen, in his relatively short time at UMW, has made a tremendous and positive impact on the learning and experiences of students. Dr. Leppanen has earned the Outstanding Young Faculty Award and the Mary W. Pinchman Award, which truly reflects his exceptional teaching ability and commitment to his work. Furthermore, his willingness to create meaningful relationships with students is what truly makes him an outstanding person. Whether it is mentoring students through psychological research, his leadership in the Psychi International Honor Society in Psychology, or even taking time to write letters of recommendation for me to be accepted into the graduate school program that I'm currently in, I know that Dr. Leppanen is, like I said earlier, truly great at what he does. I thank you all for your time, and I would like to formally introduce Dr. Leppanen for tonight's Mary Talk program.
Thank you, Armand. I told you not to be too nice, so but I'm surviving. I'm doing okay. Thank you for the very kind words. I really appreciate it. So hopefully everybody is seeing the talk pulled up now. Thank you all for being here and attending at 7:30 at least Eastern time, a little bit earlier other places in the country, or if you're other places farther away, maybe it's even later. Taking time out of your night to be here and to listen to the things that I have to talk about. The topic for my talk tonight is based in some work that I did in graduate school, where I was really interested in the relationship between what seems like a relatively standard behavior of using your hands and how it might be related to the way that people think. And so tonight's talk, I'm going to bring together a lot of research that has been done in that area, as well as a little bit of my own to talk a little bit about how being inconsistently in your right mind can have impacts on your behavior and the way that you think. Mhm. Am I not in my presentation? Oh, that's a bummer. Hold on one second, everybody. I think I have my wrong buttons picked. I go back, change this to this. Now I should have the access that I want. My apologies, everybody. Now I'm good. So where I'm going to go is starting the talk tonight by talking a little bit about what I mean when I'm talking about handedness, particularly how we're trying to relate it to people's psychology. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about the different ways in which we measure it, and you may be able to understand that, well, how you measure something in this particular area may play a role in what you observe it to be related to. And then I'll spend some time talking about how handedness is related to things like mental health, personality variables, and different aspects of our cognition, like people's long-term memory. And I'm going to end the talk by talking a little bit about kind of the why. One of the things I like best about being a psychologist and a scientist is that I get to keep being a kid and I get to keep asking why. And instead of it being annoying, it gets to be my job. So, where we'll start is by how I'm going to be talking about handedness tonight. So, generally speaking, when people think about handedness, right? If somebody asks you, what handedness are you? We generally tend to rely on the left-right distinction of handedness. Oftentimes, the hand that we use to write, or the hand that we use to draw, or the hand that we use to throw, our dominant hand is usually the hand that we say we use. Now, historically, people have always generally preferred right-handedness, right? If you go all the way back to medieval times, right, left-handedness was oftentimes considered to be a sign of the devil, or it was evil to be left-handed, and being right-handed was the correct thing to do. Even if you go back less than 100 years and you look at behaviors that were happening in school classrooms, students could be punished for using their left hand rather than using their right hand to accomplish various types of tasks. Now, it's interesting to think about given that approximately 10% of the population is left-handed, and yet that means 10% of the population is apparently just wrong because of the way they use their left hand. Now, while the left-right distinction is oftentimes informative, and we do see some relationships between direction and behavior, what I focus on more often and what a lot of cognitive psychologists focus on more often is this idea of handedness consistency. This is the idea that you either sometimes use one hand, usually your dominant hand, to do most everyday manual tasks, or you may sometimes interchangeably use your hands to accomplish different tasks depending on either what the task is or what the context in which you're trying to perform that task might be. So, a better question for somebody to ask you may also be, which hand do you prefer to use most often? Because it's this relationship between consistent handedness, using your dominant hand nearly all of the time, and inconsistent handedness, the more likely ability to use either hand, that we're going to talk a lot about as being related to some important psychological concepts. Right? So, given that those are the two main ways in which we can think about handedness as a variable, I'm going to spend a little bit of time now on how do we figure it out, right? What is handedness and how can we measure it? So, the main way in which somebody might want to think about measuring handedness is by having people actually do something, right? Being able to demonstrate that you do, in fact, use one of your hands to complete tasks is a pretty good way to understand whether or not that is your handedness. Now, if you look at the literature and how we try to understand handedness behaviors, there's really no consistent way in which everybody agrees that we should measure handedness as a way that people act. In fact, you will find a variety of measures that people may be using when they're trying to assess somebody's handedness. One of the most common is a task that we call the Purdue pegboard task. When people are completing this particular task, they are given sets of bins that have different types of pins in them, and then two columns of holes in which you can place them. Now, what researchers are interested in are how effectively can you complete that task. So they will generally have people complete as many as they can, placing pins in the holes with their left hand, with their right hand, and then also with both hands at the same time. And they use this as a way to try to demonstrate, does somebody who's really strongly handed, do they do significantly more with one hand relative to the other? And they can calculate a different score to try to understand what the efficiency of somebody's hand behavior is using this relatively simple task. Now, that seems helpful, right? I can tell if somebody who's right-handed can place more pegs with their right hand than with their left hand. But people have decided they want to try other ways that we can also measure different types of behaviors. One example is something that we refer to as the Watt hand cabinet test, which is, as the name implies, an actual physical cabinet that has a bunch of different tasks on the inside. So somebody is essentially asked to open the lids on the cabinet and then complete some of the other tasks that are on the inside, and they're going to be timed on how fast they can be doing those tasks with either one, both, or neither, or either of their hands, I could say. Right? So that's another way in which we can try and see people actually completing behaviors other than just placing pegs. Right? Sometimes people use tasks as simple as finger tapping, right? With the idea being that if you are left-handed, you should be able to press a button faster with your left hand than you can with your right hand. And so researchers will sometimes use this as a measurement of how people are able to use their hands differently. And just another way in which people will sometimes complete varieties of tasks is just another measure called the Handedness Practical Index, which is relatively similar to the cabinet test in that it's a series of different manual activities that people are being asked to complete. Right? With the general goal being across all these different measurements is to see how fast or how effectively can somebody use their hands when trying to complete manual tasks. In cases in which people don't want to use potentially expensive equipment or to use potentially clumsy pieces of objects, researchers will oftentimes rely on self-report as a way for people to identify their own handedness to the researchers. So there's, as you may expect, a wide variety of ways in which people assess handedness via self-report. Um, One of the early measurements that people used was something called Annette's Hand Preference Questionnaire, where participants would be given a list of 12 various tasks, and they would be asked, do they complete it with their left hand, their right hand, or do they use either hand to complete that task? We also saw the development of the Waterloo Handedness Inventory, which was really just a combination of other inventories, including Annette's and a few others that were produced before that, just as another way to maybe if we measure different activities in different ways, we can get a better measurement of people's handedness. And you also oftentimes will see the Edinburgh Handedness Inventory or the EHI being used a lot. Now, it's important to bring up the EHI in this context because that's the most widely cited self-report handedness inventory. Since it was published by Oldfield in 1971, it has been cited over 20,000 times in the 50 years since then. Um, and so you would think if people are all using the same inventory, they should be coming to similar conclusions. But some research that I did with my lab in graduate school really identified that how people use the EHI is highly variable. They're more than willing to change the number of items they test, how people respond to the questions, um, or even how they calculate somebody's handedness score based on the responses. And so, with this highly variable way in which people are attempting to get this information, it makes some of the conclusions that people are drawing about this relationship between handedness and behavior to be a little bit muddy, to say the least. Okay. So when people have to complete the EHI, generally speaking, they're given a sheet of paper that has 10 objects on it, right? 10 tasks they can complete, like writing, drawing, using a spoon, opening a jar, using a toothbrush, brushing your hair. And then they're asked to identify one of five options as to how they complete that task, right? Do you always use your left hand? Do you usually use your left hand? Do you have no real preference? Do you usually use your right hand, or do you always use your right hand? Now, what's important is that while this is the version of the inventory that I've used in my career and many other cognitive psychologists like to use, this is in fact by itself a modified version of Oldfield's original version of the inventory. Um, a lot of people stopped using it because the response format was pretty awkward in that you had the option to put some pluses in a column for your left hand or your right hand, and you were supposed to put two in a particular column if you would always use it, that you would only use your other hand if forced to do so. And so it was very aggressive, confusing language in how people were supposed to complete it. So many changes have been made, like this one, into how we assess people's handedness. Right. And so once people complete this questionnaire, right, the answers are really just calculated as a score, where always left is worth negative 10 points, all the way up to always right, which is worth positive 10 points. And you can then categorize people based on what their responses to this questionnaire are. From your everyday life, you would probably not be surprised to know that the most common score on the EHI is a plus 100 of somebody who uses their right hand to do everything on the list of tasks that the EHI asks about. And you'll find significantly fewer people that are scoring on the negative side, which would be indicating a preference for their left hand. Okay. So a lot of the research that I'll be talking about today uses the EHI or one of these other self-report measures. Now, you may be asking yourself, and if you are definitely on the right track for how you should be thinking about things. Is what I say I do the same as what I actually do? Is there a relationship between behavioral measurements and between self-report measurements and how we think about people's handedness? Now, there is some evidence that suggests when we use things like the Purdue pegboard that there is a correlation between what somebody's score is on the self-report measure and how effectively they complete the task, which is a pretty good indication that people seem to be accurate in what they say they're doing. But when I was in graduate school, we had a question about, well, placing pegs into a hole is different than actually completing the tasks that are in the inventory. And so we developed a task in our lab where people completed a series of 10 manual tasks, uh, most of which were on the EHI, a couple of which we had to update to things people actually do and to things you wouldn't do in the laboratory, like having somebody brush their teeth. And so we scored how people said they did those tasks, and then looked at how effectively they did those tasks. Now, in the figure that I have on the screen now, right, your y-axis is showing you what the difference in speed was between completing this series of tasks with just their dominant hand versus completing the series of tasks with just their non-dominant hand. So a larger score is indicating that it takes them significantly longer to complete the task with their non-dominant hand than their dominant hand. And if you look at the bottom, right, we have put absolute inventory scores on here, which is telling you that left and right are both combined, and it's just how strongly are you left or right indicates your absolute score. And what we were able to demonstrate is that people who reported having stronger consistency on this inventory were the ones who had longer differences in how quickly they could complete the task with their dominant versus their non-dominant hand, indicating that it was in fact much easier with the hand they said they used than the one they don't. And we were also interested in if you let people complete the tasks without telling them what to do, which hand do they use to do those tasks? And here you can see in the bottom figure that on the y-axis, we're showing how many of the tasks by proportion were completed with that person's dominant hand, so left or right, based on what their score was. And the bottom is once again their absolute score on the handedness inventory. And we were once again able to show a relatively moderate correlation, but a significant correlation statistically nonetheless, that people who reported being more consistently handed on the inventory were in fact more likely to complete every single task on the table using just their dominant hand, whereas people who scored as less consistent were more likely to be doing at least some of the tasks with their non-dominant hand. And so we took this as some evidence to suggest that people do seem to be at least somewhat accurate in self-report based on what they can actually do in their everyday lives. Now, this will become important when we start talking about why is handedness related to anything, because it's important to know that regardless of how you measure it, you are hopefully still tapping into the same mechanism. So, given that those are a couple of different ways in which people can assess handedness, how do we think of this behavior as being related to other types of human behaviors or human actions or human thoughts? Now, there's a wide range of research topics that people have looked at to relate handedness to things about us and how we act. And some of them show distinctions based on direction, and others are really only showing distinctions based on consistency. So there's some research evidence that suggests that people who report being left-handed have higher levels of depression or are more likely to be diagnosed with depression than people who are reporting themselves as being right-handed. This seems to have potentially some relationship with neural mechanisms that we'll talk a little bit about later, but it's an interesting way to see that why would something like handedness have any relationship with mental health, despite the fact that research evidence suggests they're related? Now, if we look at other aspects of people's mental health, so in this example, I'm talking about something that we call schizotypy, which is a term that's used to describe a variety of traits that are not on their own a sign of psychosis or negative mental health attributes, but they are a set of things that people will sometimes experience if they are experiencing some form of psychosis or delusions, something like schizophrenia, for example. Um, the evidence on relationships between handedness and these particular sets of variables is mixed, right? Some people find that people who are inconsistently handed are more likely to demonstrate things like magical ideation, where they are thinking about things that don't have a lot of evidence to support that they exist, but they might exist. And so they think about those things and are more likely to support that those things exist. They are, as kind of evidenced by the previous point, kind of associated with reduced affect or emotion, the emotions that you experience. And they're actually also potentially more likely to experience unusual perceptual things like hallucinations. Not on this particular list. There's also some evidence that suggests that inconsistently handed people are more susceptible to things like hypnosis. But then you can also look at other evidence that fails to find any relationship between people's handedness behaviors and their likelihood of demonstrating any of these sort of schizotypical symptoms. If we look at anxiety, right, there are some reasons to think that people who have different handedness behaviors may experience anxiety at different levels. Some research has suggested that depending on the context in which you are asking people about their anxiety, or in other words, the state that they are in at that time, that left-handed people may be more likely to experience anxiety than right-handed people. And there's some other papers that you could find in other places that would suggest almost the opposite, where maybe anxiety seems to be higher in right-handed people than left-handed people. And in either case, it is still interesting just to see that handedness is related to anxiety in whichever direction it might go. Then, kind of one last piece related to mental health is this idea that consistency of handedness, so people who more often use just one of their hands to do tasks, right, might be associated with various aspects of rumination. So we all kind of use rumination in everyday language as kind of this indicator that you're just thinking about something and can't stop thinking about it. In psychology, we oftentimes are focusing on rumination in sort of the negative direction, right? When you're thinking about bad things, depressing things, upsetting things, and don't let them go, you're really said to be ruminating on them. Um, Rumination has kind of two main aspects, where the brooding aspect is the one you generally think of as dwelling on negative things for extended periods of time. But there's also sort of self-reflective rumination that can actually be positive if you spend time actually reflecting on your sort of internal states and the things you're thinking and the things you're feeling. So not all forms of rumination are bad. And so some research also suggests that kind of within this context of consistency, left-handed people may be more likely to ruminate than right-handed people. Now, this actually makes some sense and is almost telling you the exact same thing in both of those data points, because it seems to be the case that when you look at consistency, it is related to these various types of neural mechanisms that might be related to the propensity to kind of dwell on things and continuously think about them and access your memories in various types of ways. Right? Now, it's not just mental health where we see relationships between handedness and people's behaviors. Um, if we look at the relationship between handedness and the personality trait of authoritarianism, we also find relationships here. Now, in this context, when I'm talking about authoritarianism, I'm really talking about a construct in which people will sometimes prefer to allow authority figures to have significant amounts of power, to allow them to make lots of decisions, and that why they do that seems to be tied into aspects of handedness behaviors. Now, when we think about how we measure authoritarianism in a psychological way, we generally think of it as being comprised of three main components. One of them is this sort of submission to authority component, where when somebody else has authority or has power, that somebody who is authoritarian believes that they should be the person who makes decisions because they are the person who has power. Um, Now, authoritarianism, as may be evidenced by some modern day experiences in various countries around the world, is also tied to how those authority figures talk about and feel about other people. Somebody who is authoritarian is going to share the thoughts of their authority figures in many cases. So if an authority figure sort of denounces a particular group of people, somebody who's higher in authoritarianism is more likely to agree and share many of those same beliefs. Then we also see that authoritarian people also like the fact that social conventions exist and they like to follow those social conventions, right? So when somebody has this particular personality trait, it's indicative of kind of this combination of particular behaviors that they tend to demonstrate. Now, again, it seems like it wouldn't make any sense that this particular set of behaviors would be having anything to do with handedness. But researchers tend to find evidence that suggests that people who are more consistently handed tend to score higher on authoritarianism. They tend to be more sensitive to disgust, and they also tend to be less prone to sensation seeking than people who are inconsistently handed. And so this seems to suggest that something about handedness consistency is related to the ways in which people think about and potentially process information and how they process and understand things they may not be aware of or things that they may not have a lot of knowledge about when they're taking a particular approach where they want things to be how they expect them to be and how other people have told them to be. Now, uh, other evidence suggests that where this relationship may come from could be tied to a psychological measure that we call cognitive closure. Um, Cognitive closure is the idea that some people like to come to conclusions to things. They like to find answers to things, right? Which means that when you are faced with uncertainty, right, if you have a high need for cognitive closure, you're, excuse me, going to seek out the answers to where your confusion is coming from. Whereas somebody who is lower in cognitive closure is more likely to accept things for how they are and be less likely to want to engage in different ideas. And so if we see that people who are consistently handed tend to have lower need for cognitive closure, kind of ties a lot of these pieces together, and that there may be a relationship with this belief that things should stay standard, that there are ways that things should always be done, and they're going to be less likely to seek out new experiences or new ideas, for example. Now, it's important to note that when I talk about things like this, that psychological research in many cases is about averages, right? So I am not saying that if you would score plus 100 on the EHI that you are inherently authoritarian. Um, on average, we do tend to see that people who are scoring higher in consistency are more likely to be endorsing authoritarian ideas, at least in psychological laboratory settings, right? Um, so again, another place where we see an interesting relationship between what seems like a relatively benign behavior and a particularly impactful personality trait. Interestingly enough, there also seem to be relationships between handedness behavior and creativity. In everyday life, you may kind of hear about the sort of stereotype that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people. Um, Technically, if you look at a lot of artists or actors, musicians, you do see a greater proportion of left-handed people than you would expect in those types of creative fields. But it's not inherently on its own causing a difference in people's creativity. Now, what's interesting is if you give somebody a task where you provide them with a relatively everyday object and you say, how many ways can you think of to use this object? Right? So if you give somebody a shoebox, what else can you do with the shoebox other than put shoes in it? And then you can look at how many new ideas they come up with, how many different kinds of ideas do they have, right? Are they all tool ideas? Are some of them creative ideas that involve play? Are some of them artistic ideas? Right? And you can look at what types of ideas are produced, and you can relate that to somebody's handedness score. And research suggests that inconsistently handed people are more likely to produce detailed and divergent or different or varied types of responses to that particular task than somebody who's consistently or strongly handed. There's also been some research evidence that suggests that people who play bimanually coordinated instruments, where you have to use both of your hands at the same time to complete the task of playing the instrument, may also be more likely to be inconsistently handed, which makes some sense, right? If you use both of your hands, you can use both of them to complete a joined musical task. There's also some interesting evidence that consistency of handedness is related to how people perceive things. So if you've ever seen one of those kind of ambiguous pictures of where it's either a duck or it's a rabbit, kind of depending on how you look at it or what you see the first time you look at it, uh, you can kind of go back and forth between those different perceptions of what you are actually seeing in that particular context. And there's some evidence to suggest that if you give people a task like the one shown in figure one off to the side there, and you start with, say, the duck, and you transition the picture to different versions until you would eventually get to the full rabbit picture, that when you have people do this and you ask when they can identify the thing it is changing into, that inconsistently handed people seem to be able to do it sooner in the transition than consistently handed people. Now, what's important is that as people do this task, they become more aware of what they're trying to do, and they get better at doing it through what we call a practice effect. And if you look at subsequent trials after basically the first one, where people don't have experience, that difference in handedness starts to go away. So there seems to be something particular to the initial experience of how somebody is processing these ambiguous pictures that is related to people's handedness that seems to go away once people practice the task and become better at accomplishing it. Now, where I spend almost all of my time in thinking about this particular variable is looking at how it relates to cognition, and particularly memory. Now, just really briefly, before I start talking about the findings, memory consists of a set of processes that interact with each other in a way that allows you to remember things for long periods of time in order to use them later. Um, Things like sensory memories are things that basically flash really quickly, occur very fast, and then instantly fade away if you don't pay attention to those things. If you do pay attention, Information enters what's called your short-term or your working memory, where it is active in your mind and you can be thinking about it. It's like somebody gives you a phone number and you're verbally repeating it in your head over and over and over again, right? That phone number is in your working memory at that time because you are aware that you're thinking about it. Now, most of the things that I'm going to talk about are related to long-term memory, right? The things that you know for minutes to hours to days to years. If you can remember something you did last week, you have a long-term memory for it. If you have something from a year ago, that's your long-term memory. Now, what I don't have time for is to tell you about all the different types of long-term memory and all the interesting things about how memory works. But suffice to say that where we see most differences related to people's handedness is going to be in long-term memory, in how we think about the way people hold on to and remember information for long periods of time. Now, broadly speaking, in the cognitive psychology literature, there is an effect that we refer to as the inconsistent handed memory advantage, where across a very wide variety of memory tasks, we find that inconsistently handed people are performing better than consistently handed people are. Now, we can find this in tasks that involve various types of verbal materials. So, if you give people pairs of words that don't have anything to do with each other, book and dog, right? And you look at how people are able to remember the relationship between those words later, inconsistently handed people seem to do better at knowing which words went together. We also see this happening when the words are supposed to go together and they have some form of shared meaning in which knowing that one goes with the other is going to allow you to pair those words in a more meaningful type of way. Again, inconsistently handed people seem to do better. We also see when people are asked to freely recall a list of words. So I say I give you 20 words, and then 5 minutes later I say, tell me any words that you remember from the list that I gave you. You can produce any that you want whenever you want to. Inconsistently handed people are more often retrieving more words that are correct, and they're retrieving fewer words that were incorrect. In studies that look at autobiographical memory, in other words, the memories for things from your own life, we see a similar advantage for inconsistently handed people. So, in a typical autobiographical memory study, you don't follow people around so you can ask them about what they did last week, but you'll oftentimes give them like a journal, and they'll write down events of things that happened during a particular day. And then the researcher can look at the journal later and create questions about things that the person said that they did. And when looking at how many details or how accurate people are about the things that they said they did in their journals, inconsistently handed people tend to be more accurate. Right? You can also see other forms of verbal material, like remembering information from paragraphs, having fewer false memories for things you never saw, as other ways in which we can oftentimes, I guess, some pun intended, consistently see that inconsistently handed people are doing better at memory tasks. So, given that there are these interesting relationships between handedness and mental health, personality traits, creativity, and memory, the question that I hope people have tonight is why, right? What do we think is actually happening that may be underlying these particular relationships? And if you were asking that, I have unfortunately some answers for you instead of just one. Now, where our evidence comes from is based on the way in which the body is organized. So when I talk about contralateral organization, I'm basically talking about opposites. Right? People use their left hand based on what their right side of their brain is doing. And your right hand is being controlled by things that are happening on the left side of your brain. And so we say that your motor system has contralateral organization. So what this tells us is that how people use their hands is related to what areas of their brain seem to be active while they're doing those tasks. Right? Now, this is important because generally speaking, slightly different things are happening on the left side of your brain relative to the right, right? And so if you're using one side more than the other, that may carry over into other types of processes, right? Now, this is important because if you look how information leaves the brain and goes to the rest of the body, you can literally find in the brainstem, right, where the nerve fibers actually cross over from one side of the body over to the other one, right? And what I'll show you in just a little bit is that there's also a structure in the brain itself that allows us to pass information from one hemisphere to the other that also seems to be playing a role here. So keep in mind that where these effects are coming from, we try to tie to actual biological mechanisms that may be underlying the process. Okay. So, idea number one, based on this idea of contralateral organization, is that maybe these differences come from the fact that inconsistently handed people have more communication between their hemispheres, right? If I'm using my left and my right hand more often, I am using both sides of my brain inherently more often. And so maybe it's the case that my two hemispheres now talk together better because I'm using my hands more. Or you could look at it the other way, that maybe I use my hands that way because I have a different pattern of underlying connection across my hemispheres. Now, research evidence tells us that if you present people with visual information to one of their visual fields or the other, like hand behavior, visual information also is crossing from one side of your body to the other side of your brain in this contralateral way. If you give people access to that information on both sides at different points in time, people seem to be better at remembering that information than if you have consistently just presented it to one of their visual fields, and now it's only being processed by one of their hemispheres relatively consistently. We also see that if you complete a task, right, where if I present something to your left visual field and ask you to press a button with your right hand, that requires different sides of your brain to accomplish that task. So if you can do that faster than somebody else, it would indicate that you seem to have faster transfer times of information from one of your hemispheres to the other one of your hemispheres, right? And so we tend to see that people who are left-handed, who are also oftentimes inconsistently handed, seem to have better performance on tasks that may require this transfer of information from one hemisphere to the other one. Right? I told you that we also have another important structure in our brain that helps information pass from the left side to the right side. That structure is called your corpus callosum. It's literally just a bundle of what we call axon fibers that are sending information from one side of your brain to the other one. And what we see is that inconsistently handed people tend to have a thicker corpus callosum than some people who are consistently handed. And the idea here is that if you have more fibers, you can transfer more information, which may facilitate more communication across your hemispheres, right? So it may be the case that because there's more transfer of information, we see changes in behavior that may be tied and related to this observable manual behavior. Okay. Now, what's important about caring about this transfer of information is, does using your hand affect this communication? And there is some research that suggests that using your non-dominant hand, particularly if you are a right-handed person, seems to increase what we call functional connectivity across your hemispheres. So what that means is that when one area on your left side is active, it is also talking to an area on the right side of your brain. And so if you are always using one of your hands, you're primarily using one hemisphere more than the other. And so to be able to see an increase in communication between the hemispheres tied to the use of somebody's non-dominant hand seems to be indicative that just engaging in some form of manual behavior is having some effect on people's neural activity, right? And so, big picture, right, I'm talking brain stuff here because we oftentimes are associating the brain with behavior, right? So, how you think, why you act particular ways. We are oftentimes in the field of cognitive psychology trying to link that to what might your brain be doing while those things are happening. And so to see that communication across the hemispheres is different related to handedness, and different related to manual behavior, is telling us that how the two hemispheres are communicating is important for these various types of behaviors. Okay. Now, an area that I'm currently doing some research with some students this particular calendar year is in an area of what we call saccade-induced retrieval enhancement. Now, if you haven't heard the term saccades, that just refers to making eye movements across visual space from one thing to another thing. So if you look at a clock on the wall and then you look at your TV, you have to make a saccade to get from one point to the other point, right? Research evidence seems to suggest that engaging in a process of horizontal eye movements, but not vertical ones, seems to be able to improve people's memory. And so, what will happen in this task is there will literally be a dot that flashes from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, and people are asked to just follow the dot before they complete a memory test. Right? So, they've already learned some information, and before we ask them to remember it, we have them either move their eyes to follow a dot or they just look at a dot that flashes in the center. And what we tend to see is that consistently right-handed people tend to do better on memory tests following this horizontal saccade task, whereas inconsistently handed people either don't benefit at all or are oftentimes harmed by doing this and do worse than if they just looked at a dot that isn't moving. Now, researchers think that what's happening here is that increase in communication, right? I don't have time to get into all the neural mechanisms that my team is thinking about this year, but suffice to say that when you make eye movements from the left to the right, you're also activating your opposite hemispheres of your brain as you do it. So when you look to the right, you're using your left hemisphere. When you look to the left, you're using your right. So by alternating back and forth over and over again, what you're doing is essentially creating a higher level activity across the hemispheres that is either important for communication or it's important for making one of the hemispheres more effective at what it's doing. And it seems to be the case that inconsistently handed people don't benefit from doing this task because they likely already have a higher level of communication between their hemispheres. And so this relatively simple task is pretty good evidence that there's something about this movement of information that seems to be related to differences in memory performance. And there's one other piece of information that can support moving information is that other tasks that require this alternating information, like physical touch, also seem to benefit people's memory, whereas tasks that don't, so you're hearing information in your left ear hits both your left hemisphere and your right, so alternating ears isn't fully alternating hemispheres, that task doesn't help people's memory performance. So it seems to be very particular to things that increase this activity between the hemispheres can have a benefit for people's memory performance. Right? Now, the alternative explanation that people have is also tied to neural activity, but it's the idea that the right hemisphere plays a pretty big role in things like memory and creativity. And those are oftentimes places where we see differences based on people's handedness behavior. So, according to this theory, you should see differences in right hemisphere behavior relative to handedness that might have an important effect here. So, while rare, people who are left-handed are more likely to have their language be processed in their right hemisphere, whereas the predominant majority of the population processes language in their left. So there seems to be some change in neural organization that may be related to handedness. We also see that people who are not strongly right-handed have more what we call baseline or resting activity going on in their right hemisphere than somebody who is consistently right-handed and is primarily using more of their left hemisphere. And so if we say that just a bunch of tasks that use the right hemisphere are performed better by inconsistently handed people, that could be indicative of just more use of that hemisphere that may not necessarily rely on communication between the hemispheres, right? So the idea is that just by using my left hand at all, making me more inconsistently handed, I have to be using my right hemisphere more often than somebody who is always using their right hand and really only activating the left when it comes to their motor behaviors. Right. And so there's still a lot of research going on, attempting to identify which of these mechanisms is the more likely cause of these relationships between people's handedness and their behaviors. So we don't quite have the best answer yet. So one of the things my research team is doing is looking at how those eye movements that we see being related to memory, how well can people do them? And is that going to tell us something about whether it's communication between the hemispheres or just what our right hemispheres are doing? That seems to play a role here. Um, Sorry to kind of end things on a bunch of neuroscience-y stuff, but if you'd rather have a quote, I tend to live my life by the idea that if my left side of my brain is controlling the right side of my body, then as a left-handed person, only I am truly in my right mind and other people aren't. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. I am happy to take a couple questions for a little bit. Thank you for all your attention tonight.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, we do. We already do have several questions in the Q&A box, and so I will take a minute to kind of go through some of those. Donna asked immediately if most of the audience this evening is left-handed, and particularly interested in this topic. So what I would ask is that, even though that's not a question that can be answered, if you'll just hit the raise your hand if you are left-handed, so that we can kind of get a count, and we'll see how many are actually left-handed on the presentation tonight. And while you do that, I guess the next question is, what is the practical application of measuring handedness and its personality and mental health correlations?
Yeah, so I think the way we tend to look at it is when so many aspects of behavior are kind of hard to identify or hard to measure, and you can't kind of dig around in somebody's brain, if we have a relatively easily observable behavioral measure that seems to be related to a lot of things that are going on inside people's heads, we can use that kind of like a correlate, right? That if I can know that handedness is related to things that are happening inside somebody's brain, I don't have to scan their brain. I can maybe look at how they're using their hands, and I can try to get a sense of what might be going on. And particularly from my perspective, I've never really done a lot of the hard research myself, but I consider myself a cognitive neuroscientist in that I oftentimes try to link behaviors and personalities and thoughts to brain activity, what your brain allows you to be able to do, right? And if we can see that this manual behavior is related to neural activity, that can help us try to understand what is neural organization like? Why do certain tasks work more effectively or less effectively in some people relative to other people? It's in cases where we find it to be related to mental health outcomes, it can be something that is helpful for providing treatment to people if we know that some people are going to respond differently to some forms of treatment relative to others. It helps to know that, right? And so there are a variety of places where we see this being involved practically, right? Some people think it's tied to the classroom, right? If it's related to memory, should I care if my students are inconsistently handed or not because they may do better on my tests, right? So uh, you can see a couple of different places where there are some practical applications there.
Okay, next question. What's the significance of inconsistently handed versus ambidextrous?
Okay, so when you look at measurements of handedness, right, true ambidexterity is indicative of basically no preference at all. There's also some relationship that ambidexterity is you can do any task with any hand, whereas inconsistent handedness is more open to the possibility of just alternating things, right? So if I'm inconsistently handed, which I am, I do some things with my left hand and some things with my right. I can't do everything with both, right? I cannot write with my right hand. Arguably, people would say I can't write clearly with my left hand, but I just can't do it with my other hand. So I'm inconsistently handed. I'm not ambidextrous. If I give somebody a questionnaire, somebody who's truly ambidextrous scores a 0 because they're going to say they use either hand for everything. Um, Now, in most cases where we look at how handedness relates to behavior, technically those people are just being lumped in with inconsistently handed people, right? If you look at a distribution of handedness, like the vast majority of people on the planet are consistently right-handed. And then when you look at how many people are inconsistently handed, your proportion starts to go down. And if you look at who's inconsistently handed, who is ambidextrous, it gets even smaller than that. And so it's really difficult to do research to measure and understand true ambidexterity because people who have that trait are relatively rare.
And that leads into the next question, which is more prevalent, ICH or CH?
Definitely consistent, right? You'll definitely look, if you look at 100 people, you're probably going to find 60 of them are consistently handed in the right direction, like maybe 4 or 5 in the left direction, and then you're going to find kind of a smattering of inconsistently handed people in sort of those other 25.
Okay. The next question, what's the relationship between handedness and footedness? Is there less consistency in footedness than handedness? Also, relationship between handedness and eye preference. Do those who have a particular handedness but a different eye preference have more left-right confusion?
Oh man, I am so lucky. My team just looked at this like last week. So generally speaking, that we assume there is no real relationship between the two. So being left-handed doesn't inherently mean you're going to be left-footed or right-footed. That relationship tends to be inconsistent at best, that we don't see those things being tied together. There is, excuse me, some evidence to suggest that footedness, eyedness, and sometimes earedness are less consistent in general than handedness behavior is. So people are much more likely to prefer either ear to listen to something or kick things with either foot than they are to use opposite hands to do a task they're more comfortable doing. Um, and so when it comes to right, do those things contradict each other? I think it's important what the context is, right? Where if I'm left hand dominant and right eye dominant, there may be things that are harder for me to do, and I may be worse at them if they're happening on my right side and I'm constantly having to reach really far to do things. Um, and so there are potentially places where you see kind of some jumbled communications if you're trying to use your left and your right to do different things at the same time. But that's another place where you don't see a ton of research trying to investigate exactly how those things go together.
All right. Next question, does handedness tendency show up in other primates?
From my understanding of the comparative psychology literature, most other primates are also predominantly right-handed. So if you look at populations of chimpanzees or bonobos, you would tend to observe an actually primarily right-hand dominant set of behaviors in those species as well. And from what I understand, you don't see that as much in other animals, right? So if you look at dogs or you look at cats, right, you don't see quite the same sort of uh, strong preference to one paw over the other in those particular species.
Okay. Do individuals without a corpus callosum have handedness preferences? Does being born without one versus not having one later in life affect handedness?
So, in many cases, because a lot of that information, so the actual physical manual pathways from your brain to your hands, for example, go to your brainstem more than they go across the corpus callosum. So they'll talk to some structures in your brain called the basal ganglia that will help kind of structure your movements. And then a lot of that information then goes into your brainstem, and that's where it's going to cross over from one to the other. So in many cases, when you look at hand preference in people who have had what's called a collosotomy, or people who don't have a corpus callosum, that preference can still exist because a lot of where that transfer happens is in the brainstem and not through the corpus callosum. But you see all sorts of other interesting things happen when people don't have a corpus callosum, though.
Okay. Does reading from left to right activate both hemispheres of the brain, thus making learning more effective?
So, in the vast majority of cases, you'd have to say yes. But it depends on kind of how you're using the material. So, like if you're keeping your book still and you're constantly scanning from left to right and left to right and left to right, then you are using sort of the physical mechanisms to move your eyes that are going to be activating the two different hemispheres themselves. Um, if you're not doing it kind of repeatedly and all you're doing is looking straight at something, you are no longer activating both sides, right? Because you're just focusing directly on the thing. And so it's always in the center of your visual field in that case. But when it comes to something like reading, where the stimulus expands across your visual field, so you have to be looking across to do it, you're more likely to see that happening. Now, what's interesting about reading is that reading is technically something that we call a smooth pursuit eye movement more than it's a saccadic eye movement. And there are some places where you see that engaging in smooth pursuit eye movements has very different effects on neural activity than engaging in saccadic eye movements. So there may be cases where we wouldn't see it just from the fact that we're reading across visual space because the type of movement we're doing is different.
If being inconsistently handed has benefits, can you train yourself to be inconsistently handed to increase the activity between the two hemispheres?
Uh, maybe I shouldn't admit this, but the data that I presented looking at handedness behavior and kind of the speed at which people do things was intended to be a training study. So we had brought people in over the course of multiple weeks, and we attempted to have some people do things with both hands and other people just use their dominant hand all the time to see, right? If we have people do this and practice this, does it change anything about how they behave? And kind of spoiler alert there, they didn't. And that's likely caused by they came in once a week, they did these activities for I think it was like 20 minutes or something like that at most. And then they spent all of the rest of their life outside of the lab doing whatever they're normally doing. And so if we wanted to truly see whether you can train somebody to be inconsistently handed, we'd have to find a way to get people to all the time, every day, use both of their hands instead of just what they're naturally used to doing. And that's pretty hard to do from a research perspective. But hypothetically, the fact that we know the brain is relatively what we call plastic, it can change in response to experience. Um, I would be inclined to believe that something should happen. But how much practice you have to do to make that change happen is probably well beyond what most laboratory studies are able to do.
And then this is our final question. From Joel says, I'm a psychotherapist who utilizes EMDR often, which involves bilateral stimulation, basically moving the eyes back and forth to light up new neural pathways so as to link the old trauma memories with the more functional parts of the brain. So I'd assume left-handers would be more grounded, well-rounded, intelligent, yet I'm hearing left-handers have more depression and anxiety. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so I think it's really an interesting relationship between kind of how you investigate those people, and in some cases, maybe what they're willing to admit or willing to talk about in some cases might impact where we're seeing these things come from. And I have been having so many conversations with one of my clinical colleagues about EMDR this semester while I've been doing this research project. And so we're doing a lot of pondering ourselves on whether that's something that we could investigate, right? If EMDR, right, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, does beneficial things because it's doing something with neural activity, like it should relate to handedness, right? And what we're trying to figure out is if we would expect it to be better or worse for consistently or inconsistently handed people, right? Where if an inconsistently handed person can kind of get easily kind of overloaded by doing eye movements, would they actually respond worse to EMDR than somebody who's consistently handed? And obviously, we don't know. People aren't really doing that work, but it's something we've been pondering about and trying to kind of conceptualize what might actually be happening in that sort of more clinical setting.
Well, thank you, Dr. Leppanen, for joining us this evening. I'd also like to thank Mark Simpkins from Events AV, who helped facilitate the virtual logistics of tonight's program. And thanks again to our viewers at home for joining us and being part of the conversation. Remember that this presentation will be available for viewing on the UMW YouTube channel by this time next week. There you can watch this program and browse the full catalog of Mary Talks. Our 10th season of Mary Talks will continue on November 19th with Dr. Leah Schweitzer, Director of the Speaking and Writing Center. Keep an eye out for more information for our next presentation. We look forward to seeing you then, if not earlier. Thank you and good night.